Well, thank you, Molly. First of all, thank everyone for joining us today. Say hi here from Houston, Texas. So today we're going to be talking about the geology of the Woodford Shale. I know there are other talks in this workshop that kind of tackle the geochemistry, geomechanics, and all the different things about the Woodford. This particular presentation is back to the basics, to the actual rocks, what actually is the Woodford is made, and how these facies play each other in terms of their properties. So this is a presentation that normally Dr. Roger Slatt, will normally provide in conferences or when people ask us to present about the Woodford Shale. And I can hope to the liberty now to present, of course, like he's not anymore with us, but I'm pretty sure that he's happy somewhere else and in a happy place, looking at good rocks and seeing this presentation. So let's just jump in and start discussing about the Woodford. So first of all, most of the data you're going to see today are part of work and research done by the consortium, the OU Woodford Shale Consortium, that was led by Dr. Roger Slatt. And there are many people that you're going to see names over here that they did either research in terms of master thesis, bachelor thesis, or dissertation, as well as some class projects. So if you're interested ever to get access to these, or you can contact any of these people, but you can also like contact me. I can share my email with you through the chat. So in case you want to take a look or get a copy of the dissertations or thesis. So the outline for the presentation today, it's going to be just like, let's get to the regional geology and the positional model of the Woodford Shale, then get into the rocks, the Woodford facies, and how they look like. Then finally close with some interesting comments about the chemostratigraphy and how we can use that to tie to the sequence stratigraphic framework of the Woodford Shale. And then finally, we're just going to summarize everything for you guys to discuss. So I took the liberty from Ming's presentation the first day of taking this map, this updated map from the OGS about the different like shale resources in Oklahoma. And we have to accept that definitely the Woodford Shale is the king of the shale resources of the resources shales in Oklahoma. You can see with those blue square how many wells have been drilled in the Woodford, particularly horizontal wells in the Arkoma Basin, the Anadarko Basin, the Armour Basin, and the Marieto Basin. In terms of regional geology, it's just to get an idea of how actually the basin where the Woodford was deposited formed. So you have during the late Proterozoic a rifting margin that was being developed at the southern part of the United States. And one of these rifts, normally they form a triple point, and one of the arms normally tends to failure. One of these arms is called by many like the southern Oklahoma Lockgen. And this is the reason why you develop a depot center in the Oklahoma state, as well as part of Kansas and Texas, forming what's called the Oklahoma Basin. Even though before, you can see here that right now we break the provinces in terms of like, hey, Anadarko Basin, Arkoma Basin. During the Woodford deposition time, you actually had a big basin, a kind of a greater Oklahoma Basin, with differences of paleotopographic differences through the basin, within the basin. So in terms of the Woodford, how the Woodford fit in here, in this Oklahoma Basin, you have the deposition of many different like strata pre-Woodford time during the Ordovician and Silurian, the big Arbocol group, and then you have the Simpson, Biola, and Sylvan, and then the Hunton group. After the deposition of the Hunton group, which is like a ramp like carbonates, then there was a drop of the relative sea level, which developed a big unconformity, which is called the post-Hunton or pre-Woodford conformity. And this unconformity kind of created a paleotopography across the state of Oklahoma, developing size valleys and karst holes. And this erosion was so great that it actually could erode through other formations, not only the Hunton, but also could reach out to the Sylvan and the Biola, as well as the Arbocol, depending on where you are in the basin. So on the right side, you're going to see just using the typical Blakey map, how the Devonian or early Devonian time was like looking at, and then you have a big transgression coming up after that unconformity, where you're flooding most of the mid-con area, in particularly the Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was kind of a deposit for the Locogen, kind of the southwest of Oklahoma. And that is the main area where you have thicker strata of the Woodford Shale. So this Woodford, again, is a later Devonian, early Mississippian deposit. It's just in between the Hunton group or any of the strata pre-Woodford. And then on top, you have either the Sycamore limestone, if you are talking about South Oklahoma, or you're talking about the Osage on northern Oklahoma. Now, many people discuss about the Woodford, like Woodford Lower Woodford, Middle Woodford, and Upper Woodford. I'm pretty sure like John Curtis and tomorrow Emilio are gonna be referencing to this. These are no formal members. These are kind of unofficial members that were developed by Hester in 1990, kind of like showing like, hey, we can break out the Woodford in these 3 units that looks in logs differently, particularly between the gamma ray, the density, and the resistivity. So many people refer to these ones, but each like company or each like research sometimes reference them in packages and not necessarily the same unit. So Kuykendall and Fricks in 2001 talk a little bit about that on conformity pre-Woodford. And again, that develops like in size valleys, and you can have Woodford deposited on top of the Hunton, the Woodford deposited on top of the Sylvan, as well as Woodford deposited on top of Viola and Simpson. So this is pretty important because the developing of this on conformity kind of drove like the position of the Woodford. So whenever you have a relationship between the Hunton, when the Hunton tends to be highly eroded or even eroded down to the Sylvan, you're gonna find that the Woodford Shale tends to be thicker. So for example, here in the Potawatomi and Seminole like counties, you're gonna see on the left your Hunton map where the Hunton is mostly absent in the middle of this fissure, or kind of a line northwest, southeast fissure. And then over there is where actually the Woodford Shale tends to be thicker. So that paleotopography kind of represent that. So McCollum in 2014 kind of interpret these as incised valleys in the Potawatomi Seminole area, as well as part of the Cleveland County, when you have these big holes that were where the Woodford was able to get thicker. So more accommodation space, thicker Woodford. Now looking at Emilio Torres' like dissertation was finished up early this year. He has maps kind of like from regional Woodford structure map, as well as Woodford thickness and the Hunton thickness. So here we can see a farther away picture, and probably he's gonna discuss them tomorrow more, but you're gonna notice how the Woodford tends to get deeper towards the deeper part of the Narco Basin, towards the southwest. And then it tends to be thicker whenever you are lacking that Hunton, as long as you are in kind of that basin area. So of course, there are areas where we don't have them much well controlled, where we can interpret exactly how this relationship was, but this relationship holds pretty well, except for when you get down south, when the Hunton is not present anymore, in kind of getting to the Marietta Basin, and you only have Woodford deposited on top of Sylvan Shale as kind of a unconformity, but not really erosional surface. So the depositional model of the Woodford, then you have like kind of like a transgression at the beginning of the Woodford, and that in the moment you're unlapping to that surface or pre-Woodford conformity, and then afterwards you're depositing, you kind of reach out your maximum flowing surface, and during that time you deposit the upper part of the Woodford, what tends to be like more cherty, more lateral continuous, and these tends to represent more a Heiston time. It's not like a deltaic Heiston style, but instead it's just a time where the relative sea level was high, and you have a more continuous deposition of sediments across the basin. So the facies that you find in the Woodford relates a lot to these changes from the bottom of the Woodford, or the lower part of the Woodford, towards the upper part of the Woodford. Particularly the differences between the content of biogenic silica coming from radial area into the basin, due to upwelling from the southeast of deeper water and colder water. So some of the examples today includes the outcrops in the Arbuckle. So even though Oklahoma is very flat and the Arbuckle Mountains are the great place to look at Woodford rock, if you ever are interested about this, feel free to reach out. So now jumping into the rock data, we have like different classification of the Woodford facies. As you see here, Galvis 2017 was one of the greatest work in terms of like breaking down to many facies that have different looking at in outcrops. And then they kind of like, you can group them depending of if they're more fissile, they're flaggy, they're calcareous. Most of them are just mud rocks types. And you can group both of them into either soft or fissile laminated rock, or hard, which is indurated blocky group. So the main group of those facies are going to be kind of your Siliceous Shale, your Siliceous Mudstones, and your Chert. And then you have also some presence of dolomite shales and dolomite mudstones into this rock, as well as some Argillaceous shale as well. So they tends to be, the Woodford tends to have a high content of coarse, either the tritol biogenic, a low content of carbonate, except for the limestones or the dolomitic limestones, and then some of the clay-rich rock that tends to have higher clay content. On the right side is a reference stratigraphic column from a type section of the Woodford in the Argillaceous Mountains, where it gets all the way up to 330 feet of Woodford shale, as well as it's kind of representing the full section of the Woodford. Now, of course, not all of you work with outcrops. That's the work that most of the students do. So I want to give you an example of Woodford core. So this is one of our core that was part of my dissertation. And this is from the Marietta Basin, so it's southern Oklahoma. And you have a deposition of about like 175, 80 feet of Woodford shale over there. But you still see the same profile when you have kind of a clay-rich package at the bottom. Then you start like having more like silica-rich, and then going back to the Argillaceous shale, and then going back to the black share on the top with phosphate nodules. So these pie charts represent the mineralogy of the data in terms of like how the black share tends to have like a very high content of coarse. Then after that, you will have your Siliceous Mudstones, which is the gray color, then Siliceous shale, and finally the Argillaceous shale tends to have the higher clay, except for the green claystone at the bottom. So for the core, then you have a dominant of Siliceous shale and as well as Siliceous Mudstone and Chert. So just quick examples of how they look like in core. You have the Siliceous Mudstone, which is the most common typically in this core. It tends to have a medium reflectivity, 60% coarse. The TOC is kind of medium for the Woodford. So the Woodford can have all the way from like 2%, 3%, all the way up to 16, 17 in outcrops where it's immature. But here you have like 4, 6% and in this rock, which is in the kind of the old window. And this one you have aligned radiolary and Tasmanitis, but the fractures tends to be bounded into that specific unit. The Siliceous shale tends to be more laminated, and these ones don't normally show like mineralized fractures, and you have a less content of coarse and a little slightly higher content of clay, but TOC tends to be higher in this rock. Then the Argillaceous shale is the one that has a higher clay in terms of the true Woodford facies, and the TOC tends to be higher. And these are mostly typical from the bottom or the lower part of the Woodford shale, as well as close to the maximum flowing surface. Then finally, the black Chert tends to have fractures. These fractures as well tends to be like sometimes mineralized, and other times it tends to have opens and hydrocarbons inside, but most of it is 90% coarse and very little content of clay. The TOC is low in this rock, is somewhere between 2 and 4%, sometimes even lower than that. So as I said, there's two big groups, those two big groups of facies. Again, for the rest of the presentation, I'm gonna refer them to hard rock, which are the kind of the Chert or the Siliceous Mudstone, which are more blocky. And then you have the soft rock, which are more laminated or shaly. So pictures on the picture from the outcrop kind of show how they look like after their weather, and it's very easy to differentiate one type rock from the hard from the softer one. And that interbedding is consistently going from the bottom to the top. It's just that the proportions change. So again, that red color is going to be represent my soft beds or the soft rock, and the green color are the hard. You notice how the coarse content in the hard is higher than in the soft, but it's the opposite for the clay content. And the carbonates tends to be very low, except for those like dolomitic beds. In the thin sections, you notice a lot of the allochems over there. In the terms of the soft rock, it tends to be flattened. So these are mostly the Tasmanitis. And in the hard rocks tends to be preserved because you have a early crystallization or cementation of those allochems, preventing them to getting flat. In core pictures, in the front of the core, it might not be that easy to separate this rock, But I recommend you, this is a quick tip, a good tip is just to look at the back of the core, and it can show you how the drilling bit actually responds to that breaking of the rock, and you can separate soft from hard very easily. So this is the same example before, but as I said, the two main allochems in the rock are the Tasmanites, which tends to be like organic wall marine microfossils, as well as radiolaria. So they can be flattened in the case of the Tasmanites, it can be whole if they're crystallized, and the radiolaria, they tend to dissolve very easily. That's why you enrich the rock of the Woodford with silica, but sometimes you can preserve the structure of the radiolaria over there. So again, the hard and brittle, they tend to represent like more biogenic in terms of the harder rock or the biogenic cores. And then when you approach to more clay-rich rock, then it tends to have a more detrital input into the system while the Woodford is. So the dominant of these phases, it changes along the rock, but they have effect in terms of ductility and brittleness of the rock. So talking about that, we can jump at the other part of the presentation, which is talking about the fractures and propagations and how the properties of the rock and the facies work. So again, as I said, fractures, mineralized fracturing core in outcrop tends to be bounded in terms of bedding, and most of the fractures tends to be higher number of them or very well defined in the hard rock, and they tend to stop when they approach the softer rock. This is a great example of those fractures that tends to be particularly the early ones, like this one in the core, when they're mineralized very early before compaction, and then after compactions, they tend to hold there. Sometimes they tend to get squeezed, forming these tecmatic fractures. Most of them tends to have a replacement of calcite or dolomite, mostly dolomite. But here you have example where you have this kind of like Siliceous Mudstone and Siliceous Shale, and tends to have more Argillaceous Shale when the Tasmanites are flattened. So that's why you have a difference between how they look like in thin section, cross-polarized, as well as ACM and EDS. So again, most of these color tends to be dolomite and magnesite flaring out from the fractures. The matrix is definitely a big driver. In here, you can see how these clay-rich matrix tends to be the end of these fractures, or tends to be propagate worse in those fractures. But then the ones that tends to have those silica-rich tends to be higher. Even the ones that have pyrite, high pyrite and organics also can develop fractures over there. So the clay is really what makes the rock a little bit less brittle, for not saying ductile. So talking about that, the hardness, we normally use a tool which is called the piccolo hammer or the rebound hardness hammer. And then here you can see it drops kind of a ball into the rock and rebound and measure that rebound, and that tells you a little bit about the hardness. So notice how the Argillaceous Shale, the Siliceous Shale, and the brown Siliceous Shale, so the shaly rock or the softer beds tends to have a lower hardness, but the Siliceous Mudstones and the Chert, as well as the dolomitic rock, tends to have a higher hardness. And then normally tied to the mineralogical brittleness index, which relates to how much coarse and is in the rock and how much clay it is in the rock. So again, example from the core, you have a lower section of the Woodford, then you reach your condensed section, then you have your high system track. And here we can see changes in the rebound hardness. These were done every bed. So because it's so interbedded, you have back and forth of those. So the main trends is what you need to focus. But when you tie those to XRD, we can notice that the rebound hardness tends to be lower from high clay content and higher for coarse content. And those tied to the facies, either the black Chert or the Siliceous Mudstones or the Siliceous Shales. Now, in terms of brittleness, we did some tests. Daniela Becerra in 2017 actually do like unconfined compressed analysis for these different facies, particularly from the soft and the hard. You have example of the Siliceous Shale on the left and the Chert on the right. And you can notice how the Siliceous Shale tends to have a more ductile response or less brittle response compared to the Chert, resulting in a higher jump modulus for the harder rock and lower jump modulus for the softer rock, as well as slightly changing the Poisson ratio for those. So the bed thickness is key as well, because we notice in outcrop and also in core that when you have thinner beds, it tends to have a higher frequency of fractures in the rock, but then also that ties to what kind of facies is you're measuring. So when you're looking at soft beds, they tend to have higher fractures in terms of when the bed thickness are lower or less than 1 inch. But when you look at the harder beds, then you can definitely notice how the fracture in frequency or density increase when you have thinner beds. So it makes a huge difference when you have thicker beds, even though they're 50% or 50% of these groups, compared to when you have a high frequency bedding. So this picture shows high frequency in the lower part and then lower frequency in the upper part. For Geochem, I know Emilio Torres, a good friend of mine and part of the team. He's going to present tomorrow and probably discuss this in detail. But a lot of our data from previous research is plotted over here when you have TOC versus S2. So in here, you can notice that most of those data from Rockyval plot into the type 2 oil-prone data, which we know that biomarker work done by Dr. Phil and his students shows that these are marine shale organic matter. So these tends to have a big variety of like TOC in the rock, from outcrop and immature rock, very high TOC, to very mature or over mature rock when you have a very low TOC. Looking for the core data, we can see that there is also a relationship between the facies, when the black Chert tends to have lower TOC and the Argillaceous shales and the Siliceous shales tends to have the higher TOC. So for TOC, again, soft and hard, this is a great plot when you can see that the hard beds really don't change in terms of TOC. They hold over there close to the 3%, but then it's the soft beds, the ones that are shaly, the ones that vary in TOC along the section. So this is very important when you're measuring samples and TOC. Be sure that which one you choose to represent better your package of rock over there, because you can easily choose a sample that has a high TOC, but everything around tends to be actually low TOC. And these all again relate to facies, and TOC tends to be higher in the shales compared to the mudstones and the Chert. So our RQ or CQ is kind of reservoir quality or completion quality. Galvis prepared this nice like chart when we have 3 different models. So this is very conceptual. We think it applies to the current completion reservoir quality of the rock. We think that the sweet spot is in the model 2 when you have kind of the same ratio of soft and hard beds. And they tends to be thinner, so it kind of improves or helps for the fracture density distribution or the SRV of the rock. When you have a model 3, you might have good frackability and better completions quality. However, the reservoir quality is not that good because you don't have that much of the organic matter and organic porosity into this. In case of the model 1, then you have too much soft rock, and this soft rock might be good in organics, good soft rock, but might not complete as good. Finally, my last 2 slides are about chemostratigraphic proxies. So if you want to understand better your Woodford in your area, we have done a lot of the work we're using XRF. Be sure to ask us if you have any idea how to use your XRF data. But then we noticed that there is a good idea to use the XRF to separate biogenic cores from like the detrital cores, because XRD cannot really separate them. But if you play the silica aluminum ratio, you can notice that the silica aluminum ratio tends to be higher for those like biogenic cores. But then when you compare it to the titanium zirconium, that tends to be kind of proxies for the detrital input, they tends to be the lowest in the Chert rock and the Siliceous Mudstones. And then they're higher in the shales. So that's giving us evidence that the biogenic is dominating when you're depositing these mudstones and Chert, but then the detrital's taking over when you're depositing the shales. So that relates to the clay content, but then also in the organic matter. So when you look at the molybdenum, uranium, you can notice that molybdenum tends to be higher in the high TOC rock, but it tends to be lower in the low TOC rock. So tying back to the Consortium framework, using the core, for example, where you have the Ceylon shale at the bottom, so you have unconformity over there, then you go from that lower section of the Woodford. When you have a higher titanium and zirconium, you're being closer to probably to shoreline, higher detrital content, and then you're switching and decreasing that titanium zirconium, but the silica aluminum ratios stay kind of similar. So you're still holding there in terms of like biogenic detrital. But then after you reach your maximum fluent surface, you're in high stand, you have a lot of this upwelling coming up to the system. This results in a lot of these rock being deposited with biogenic dominated, and then you have a higher silica aluminum, but then a drop in titanium zirconium. So that relates to how the biogenic input is higher in the upper part of the Woodford with the upwelling. Then TOC tends to be higher in the lower part of the Woodford or below the maximum flowing surface, and that ties to the mineralogy as we discussed before. So in summary, the Woodford Shale is Devonian, late Devonian, early Mississippian, 4 main facies. These are the Argillaceous Shale, Siliceous Shale, Siliceous Mudstone, and Chert. They are pretty good. But then when you group them soft and hard, it can help you a lot to understand the properties of the rock. So there is evidence of fractures, and these fractures, early fractures, they're tecmatic, and we tend to be bounded into the beds. And again, the depositional model ties very well when you use chemostratigraphy, and you notice a very nice evidence for early transgression and transgressing system track at the bottom of the Woodford, and then you change towards a highest system track at the top of the Woodford. So again, these are some references we're going to share with you guys. Thank you very much, and everyone that was involved in this, and the OGS for inviting us to present. Thank you.